I want to start with the smallest thing. Not the record. Not the crowd. Not the 10 seconds everybody argues about. I want to start with 2 hands coming up. A man raised his guard. That's it. That's the whole image I've been chasing for the better part of my life. A man stood on a mat, and he brought his hands up in front of his face, palms loose, elbows in, the way every fighter on earth learns to do in their first week. The most ordinary motion in the entire sport. A child does it. You'd do it right now if I threw something at your head. Your hands would come up before your brain even filed the report. It means nothing. It's nothing. Except this man hadn't done it in 23 years. 23 years. Sit with that number, because I'm going to make you carry it the whole way through this. 23 years this man had stood in front of other men who wanted to put him down, and not once, not one single time, had he felt the need to lift his hands and protect his own face. He didn't guard. That was the thing about him. That was the legend of him before there was ever a legend worth telling. You'd come at him, and he simply wasn't where you were aiming, and then the exchange was over, and you were the one on the mat wondering what the floor was doing so close to your eyes. He fought with his hands low. Relaxed. Almost rude about it. Because raising your guard is a thing you do when part of you believes you might get hit, and that man had stopped believing he could get hit a very long time ago. And for 23 years, he'd been right. And then, one afternoon, in a quiet room, in front of exactly 3 people, this man raised his guard. And then, and this is the part that has kept me up more nights than I'll admit to, then he smiled. Now, I have spent 30 years of my life around fighters. I've stood in the stance. I've been the smaller man looking up at the bigger one, feeling my own throat go dry, feeling that animal thing in the back of the skull start screaming run, while the front of the skull tries to look calm. I know what a guard means. I know what a smile means on a fighting man's face, and I know it almost never means what you think. And I'm telling you that those 2 things together, the guard going up after 23 years, and the smile right behind it, those 2 things don't belong in the same sentence. A man raises his guard because he's worried. A man smiles in a fight because he's not. You don't get to be both at once. It's a contradiction. It shouldn't exist. It existed. 3 people watched it exist. And here's where my trouble began. The trouble that turned this from a story I heard once into a thing I had to go and dig up with my own 2 hands. Because I found those 3 people. It took me years, but I found them, one at a time, in 3 different cities, and I sat down across from each one, and I asked each of them the same simple question. What did you see in those 10 seconds? And not one of them told me the same story. Stay with me here, because before I take you into that room, you have to understand the man whose guard came up. You have to understand him the way the world understood him then, which is to say, you have to believe, the way everybody back then believed, that what happened to him was impossible. 23 years. Not one loss. Let me tell you what a number like that actually means, because people hear it, and they nod, and they don't feel it. In the fight world, everybody loses. That's not pessimism, that's arithmetic. You fight long enough, somebody catches you. Somebody's faster on the day. Somebody's been studying tape. You get older, you get slower. A 22-year-old with no fear and fresh knees walks in and takes the thing you spent your life building. It happens to all of them. The greatest names you've ever heard, the ones carved into the sport like names into stone. Go look them up. They've all got a lost column. Every one. The lost column is part of the deal. It's the tax you pay for staying in long enough to matter. This man had no lost column. For 23 years, they set people at him. Young ones, old ones, big ones, the technical surgeons, and the wild brawlers, and the cold calculating types who'd watched every minute of footage that existed on him. Men who trained for 1 year for the single purpose of being the one who finally did it. And one after another, they walked onto the mat with him, and one after another, they walked off it having learned the same lesson everyone before them had learned, that there was a gap between what they thought they knew about fighting and what this man actually was, and that the gap was wider than a life. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy, lazy, really, to paint this man as some kind of cold monster, the undefeated machine, the villain at the top of the mountain waiting to be knocked off. That's the cheap version, and I won't give it to you, because it isn't true, and because the men who actually knew him would never forgive me for it. This man wasn't a monster. By every account I gathered, and I gathered a lot, he was quiet. Disciplined past the point most people can imagine. He didn't talk much. He didn't sell himself. He didn't need to. He'd figured out, somewhere early, that the loudest man in any room is usually the most frightened one, and he had built his entire life into the opposite of that. He was the still man. The one in the corner you didn't notice until it was much too late to do anything about having noticed him. They called him things over the years, the way they always do. The wall. The cold one. A dozen names in a dozen places, because a man like that collects names the way a ship collects barnacles. But the name that stuck, the one I heard most often when I went looking, was simpler than all of those. They called him the man who couldn't be hit. Not the man who didn't lose. The man who couldn't be hit. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole story. Because plenty of fighters went without getting touched for a while. But over 23 years? You'd expect at least the appearance of danger. A close call. A night where he looked human. A moment where the crowd gasped because a punch got through and grazed him and reminded everyone he had a face that could bleed like anybody's. There was no such night. That's what the witnesses kept coming back to, all three of them, the one thing they didn't argue about. Before that afternoon, nobody living had seen this man's guard go up. Nobody had seen him worried. Nobody had seen anything get close enough to his face to make those two hands rise. The guard was a thing he simply did not own anymore, like a word in a language he'd stopped speaking as a child. The reflex was gone, trained out of him by 23 years of being right. And I've come to think, that's exactly why what happened mattered the way it did. Because when a man like that, a man who has genuinely forgotten how to be afraid, suddenly remembers in the space of a few seconds, when those long dead hands come up off his hips and rise to cover a face that hasn't needed covering in 2 decades, that's not a fight you're watching anymore. That's a resurrection. Something the man buried a long time ago, clawing its way back up into the daylight. The question that's haunted me, the one I still can't put down, is what reached down into that grave and pulled it back out. Let me tell you how I even came to be sitting across from these 3 people, because it matters to how much you should trust what comes next. And I'd rather you trust me on the doubt than on the certainty. That's a strange thing for a storyteller to say. I know. Stay with it. I heard about this the way you hear about most of the real ones. Sideways, secondhand, in a gym late at night after the lights over the main floor had gone down, and it was just a few of us old wrecks sitting on the folding chairs nobody bothers to put away. An old coach, older than me, was talking, and he wasn't trying to impress anybody, which is how you know it was real, because the men trying to impress you always reach for the famous stories, and the men telling you the truth reach for the ones that still bother them. And this one bothered him. You could hear it. He said, I knew a man who saw the day the wall got its guard up. And then he said the thing that put the hook in me for good. He said, trouble is, 2 other men saw the same 10 seconds, and if you put the 3 of them in a room, you'd swear they were describing 3 different afternoons. I couldn't let that go. I'm built wrong that way. A clean story I can hear and enjoy and forget by morning. A story with a crack in it, a place where the accounts don't line up, that's the kind that follows me home and sits at the foot of the bed. So I went looking. It took years, and I'll spare you the dead ends. But I found them. 3 people who were in that room when the man who couldn't be hit raised his guard. And I'm going to give them to you one at a time, the way I got them, because the order matters, and because I want you to feel what I felt, which was the floor tilting a little more under me with each one. The first was a fighter himself. Younger than the champion back then, a hard professional man who'd been brought in that day for an entirely ordinary reason, and who watched those 10 seconds from maybe 8 feet away with the trained eyes of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at, or thought he did. The second was not a fighter at all. The second was a person who had no business being able to read a fight, who shouldn't have caught the things a professional would catch, and who, for exactly that reason, saw something the professional swore up and down never happened. Saw it in the eyes, and would not be moved off it, not by me, not by anyone, not in all the years since. And the third didn't really watch the 10 seconds at all. The third was watching something else. The third kept their eyes on the one thing the other 2 were too busy to look at, and because of that, the third is the only one of them who can tell you the part that actually matters. The part that came after the hands went up. The part that, the more I chased this thing, I've started to believe was the whole point of the afternoon, and the fight was just the price of admission. 3 chairs. 3 stories. 1 set of 10 seconds that, near as I can tell, only happened once. Now, before I take you to the first chair, before I sit you down across from the fighter and let him tell you what a trained eye saw, I have to take you into the room itself. I have to put you on that mat, in that light, with that stopwatch ticking on the side table, because all 3 of them agreed on the room even when they agreed on nothing else, and the room is where the impossible thing was about to come and find a man who'd forgotten it was even possible. Let me set it for you the way all 3 of them set it for me. The same walls, the same windows, the same long, terrible quiet before anybody's hands came up at all. It wasn't an arena. I want that clear from the start, because when people hear about a fight that mattered this much, they picture lights and a crowd and noise, and this was the opposite of all of that. This was a small room, a training room, the kind of place that smells like canvas and old sweat and the particular dust that lives in a building where men have been throwing each other to the floor for 30 years. All three of them described the same light. That's the first thing that struck me. Three people who couldn't agree on what happened, agreeing perfectly on how the room looked. High windows along one wall, set up near the ceiling the way they do it in old training halls, so the light comes down on you instead of in your eyes. And it was the back half of the afternoon, so the sun was coming through those high windows at an angle in long gold bars, and you could see the dust turning slow in the light, the way it does in a church when nobody's talking. One of them, the second one, the one who wasn't a fighter, used exactly that word to me. Church. Said the room felt like a church before the part where everybody's supposed to be quiet, except nobody had told the room a service was about to start. The mat was in the middle. Tatami, worn pale in the centers where the most work happened, darker at the edges where the feet didn't go as often. And off to one side, on a low table against the wall, there was a stopwatch. I asked all three about the stopwatch, because it bothered me. Why would anybody be timing this? And the answer, near as I could put together, is that nobody was timing the fight. The fight wasn't supposed to be a fight. The stopwatch was there because the champion ran his sessions by the clock, always had, broke everything into measured rounds and measured rests, disciplined down to the second the way he was disciplined down to the second in everything else. The stopwatch was just part of the furniture of how that man lived. It happened to be sitting there ticking when the thing happened, and so it timed the thing, without meaning to, without anybody asking it to. 10 seconds. That's what the stopwatch said after. The one fact in this whole story that doesn't argue with itself, because it came off a machine instead of a man, and machines don't have a version of events. 10 seconds, from the moment they touched to the moment it was over. You could read this whole thing to yourself in the time it takes to tie one shoe. The champion was already in the room when the others came in. Of course he was. That was him, early, settled, still. He was sitting on the edge of the mat the way he always sat, and the fighter who walked in that day, the first chair, the one I'll bring you to in a moment, told me the thing he remembered most about that first sight was how completely at rest the man was. Not relaxed the way you relax when you're trying to look relaxed. At rest the way a mountain is at rest. The way something is at rest when it has genuinely never once, in 23 years, had a reason not to be. And then the lean man came in. Now I have to be careful again, because this is the place where the story wants to turn into a fairy tale, and I won't let it. The lean man didn't come in like thunder. He didn't come in with an entrance. Two of the three told me they barely noticed him at first, that he came in quiet, almost ordinary, a slight man in simple clothes who moved through the door and across the floor without making the air change at all. He didn't look like the answer to a 23-year question. He looked like a man who'd wandered into the wrong room and was too polite to say so. The fighter, the first chair, the professional, the trained eye, he was the one who noticed early. And the thing he noticed, he told me, wasn't anything the lean man did. It was something he didn't do. Everybody, the fighter said to me, everybody who walks into a room with a champion does the same thing. They look at him. They can't help it. You walk in, your eyes go to him, because part of you needs to know where the danger is. It's animal. You can't stop it. And he said the lean man walked into that room and didn't look. Crossed the whole floor and never once let his eyes go to the still man on the edge of the mat. Not avoiding him, that would have been its own kind of telling. Just not needing to know where the danger was. The fighter said That was the first cold thing he felt that day. A small thing. A man not looking where everybody looks. And he said he remembered thinking, before a single hand had moved, before the stopwatch had ticked once, that's not confidence. I know what confidence looks like. That's something I don't have a word for. They didn't speak much. There were a few words, and even the words are in dispute, which tells you everything about what kind of story this is. But there was a moment, a short exchange, and then the two men stood up, and they came to the center of the mat, into the pale warm place where all the real work had always happened, and they faced each other in the long gold light with the dust turning slow around them. And one of them, the lean man, let his hands hang low and relaxed at his sides. And the other one, the man who couldn't be hit, the man who hadn't covered his face in 23 years, he also let his hands hang low. Of course he did. That was him. That was the whole legend of him, standing there in the dust and the gold, hands down, at rest, certain. Two men with their guards down. The stopwatch sitting on its table. And then somebody's hand moved, and the 10 seconds began, and from here on out, I can only tell you what each of them swore they saw, because this is where the one afternoon splits into 3. The first man I found was the fighter, and I'll be honest with you, he was the one I wanted to believe most going in, because he was the trained eye. He was the professional. If anybody in that room could tell me cleanly and coldly what actually happened in those 10 seconds, free of all the mystery and the church light and the haunted feeling the others carried, it would be him. The fighter sees fights. The fighter has no reason to dress it up. That's what I told myself, sitting down across from him all those years after. He was an old man by the time I found him. Hands like a bag of walnuts, the way they get. But his eyes were still a fighter's eyes. They checked me when I came in, measured me, filed me, all in about a second and a half, the same animal habit the lean man hadn't had. He poured coffee. He took a long time getting to it. And when he got to it, the first thing he said, before I'd asked him anything specific, was this. He said, "I'll tell you right now, so you don't get the wrong idea from whatever those other two told you. The champion was never in any danger. Not for 1 second of those 10. Whatever you came here hoping I'd say, I won't say it. He was never in danger." And then he told me his version. And I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to me, flat and certain, because his certainty is part of the evidence. He said the lean man moved first. Not a strike, a step. The fighter was very precise about this. He said the lean man stepped in on a slight angle, the left foot, and that the step covered less distance than you'd think a man would need, and that this was the first genuinely impressive thing, because the lean man had measured the range from across the room without ever seeming to measure it, and his step put him exactly where he needed to be and not 1 inch further. "Most men step too far," the fighter told me. "They commit. They overcommit. This one stepped like he'd already been there 100 times and knew the floor." And the champion, the still man, did what the still man had done for 23 years. He wasn't there. The fighter said it was beautiful, in a cold way, watching it from 8 feet off. The champion shifted, barely, a small economical movement that took his head off the line the lean man's hand was traveling toward, and the fighter said you could see the entire 23 years in that one small shift. No panic. No wasted motion. The mountain moving 1 inch, exactly 1 inch, because 1 inch was all that was required, and the man had long ago stopped spending more than a situation cost. That's where it should have ended, the fighter told me. That's where it ended 1,000 times before, with 1,000 other men. They reach, he isn't there, and now they're committed and open, and he finishes it. That's the whole pattern. 23 years of the same pattern. He set his coffee down, and for about half of 1 second, that's exactly what was happening. The lean man had reached, the champion wasn't there, and the champion started to do the thing he always did next. And here's where the fighter's voice changed. Just slightly. The certainty stayed, but something moved underneath it, and I leaned in the way you lean in when a man who's sure of himself hits the one part he isn't sure of, and is determined not to show it. The lean man's hand, the fighter said. The one that reached. It didn't finish reaching. I asked him what he meant. It didn't finish, he said again, like saying it twice would make it make sense. He reached, the champion slipped it like he always slips it, and then the reach just stopped being a reach. Halfway. Turned into something else. The hand changed its mind in the middle of the air. He looked at me. I've watched 10,000 men throw 100,000 strikes. A strike is a decision. You decide, you commit, you throw. You can fake the start of it. Everybody fakes. But the fake is still a decision. It's a decision to fake. This wasn't a fake. A fake has a plan. This hand reached like it meant it, and then became something with a completely different plan in the middle, with no decision in between that I could see. And I see everything. That's my whole life, seeing it. He shook his head. I couldn't see the seam. There was no seam. And I said, gently, because you have to be gentle with a proud man at the edge of the thing he can't explain. I said, so what did the champion do? And the fighter was quiet for a moment. And then he said the thing that cracked his own story right down the middle, even though he'd opened the whole conversation swearing the man was never in danger. He said, the champion raised his guard. Now I want to stop the tape right there, because this is the first place the floor tilted under me, and I want you to feel it tilt the way I did. Here's a man, the fighter, the trained eye, the professional, who sat me down and opened with a vow. The champion was never in danger. Said it before I asked. Said it like a man closing a door he didn't want me walking through. And then he walked me through his own account, step by step, calm and certain, the master slipping the reach the way he'd slipped 10,000 reaches, and the account arrived, on its own, at his own mouth, at the one image that breaks the vow in half. The champion raised his guard. You don't raise your guard against a man who isn't dangerous. You don't lift hands that have stayed down for 23 years against a threat that isn't real. The body doesn't lie about that. The body is the most honest thing a fighter owns. It'll tell the truth about fear a half second before the man's pride can stop it. And the champion's body, after 23 years of telling the truth that it could not be hit, suddenly told a different truth. It told the truth that something was coming that it could not simply not be there for. And it brought the hands up. I put this to the fighter, as kindly as I could. I said, you told me he was never in danger, but you also told me he raised his guard. Help me hold both of those at once, because I can't. And the fighter got not angry. Worse than angry. He got quiet. The kind of quiet a proud man gets when you put your finger exactly on the splinter he's been carrying for decades and pretending isn't there. And he said something I've never forgotten, something I've turned over 1,000 times since, because I think it's the truest thing anybody said to me in this whole search, and the man who said it didn't even fully believe it himself. He said, "Raising your guard isn't danger. Raising your guard is the moment before you'd be in danger. He saw it coming and he covered. That's not a man getting hit. That's a man too good to get hit, doing the one thing that made sure he didn't." He looked at his walnut hands. The fact that he had to do it at all, the fact that for the first time in 23 years, being where the punch wasn't enough, and he had to actually cover his own face like a beginner. And here the old fighter stopped and started again lower. I've spent a long time telling people he was never in danger. And I believe it. I have to believe it. Because the other thing I'd have to believe is that I watched the only man I ever thought was finished, complete, beyond the rest of us. I'd have to believe I watched him become a beginner again for 1 second. And I don't want to have watched that. So I tell people he was never in danger. And every word of it is true. And I still don't sleep right. 3 chairs. I told you that at the start. That was the first one. The fighter, the trained eye, who swore the champion was safe and then described, in his own careful words, a man whose body betrayed 23 years of certainty in a single second, and who has chosen, ever since, to call that safety, because the alternative is more than he can carry. I left his place that day, and I sat in my car for a long time before I started it, because I'd come looking for the clean version, the professional's version, the one without mystery. And the professional had handed me the deepest mystery of all, a man so sure of what he saw that he'd built a 30-year vow around it, and the vow had a crack in it shaped exactly like 2 hands rising to cover a face. And I hadn't even gotten to the second chair yet. The one who wasn't a fighter at all. The one who looked at none of the things the fighter looked at. Not the step, not the reach, not the seam that wasn't there, and looked instead at the one place the fighter never thought to look. The eyes. The second chair took me the longest to find, and when I found it, I almost wished I hadn't. Not because the person was hard to talk to. The opposite. Because what they told me reached into the clean professional account I'd just gotten and turned it inside out, and I'd liked having a clean account. A man likes a floor under him. The second person was not a fighter. I'll keep them vague on purpose, because they asked me to, and because it doesn't matter who they were, it matters that they were nobody. That's the whole value of the second chair. The fighter looked at the fight with the eyes of a man who'd seen 10,000 fights, and so the fighter saw the things a fight is made of. The step, the range, the reach, the slip, the seam he couldn't find. The second person had never seen a fight in their life. Didn't know a jab from a hook. Couldn't have told you who was winning if you'd stopped the clock and asked. And because of that, because they had no idea what they were supposed to be watching, they watched the wrong thing. They watched the lean man's face. A fighter would never do that. A fighter watches the hips, the shoulders, the weight, the hands, never the face, because the face lies and the body doesn't, and every trained eye on earth learns to stop looking at the one part of a man that's built to deceive you. But the second person didn't know that rule. So while the fighter was reading the lean man's body, the second person was looking, the entire time, straight into the lean man's eyes. From the side, maybe 10 feet off, in that gold light. And they never looked away. And here is what they told me. And I want you to hear that it came out of them not like a fighter telling a war story, but like a person confessing something they've carried alone for a very long time and never had anybody to give it to. They said, his eyes were sad. I sat with that. I come expecting fury, or ice, or that famous emptiness people put on legends. Sad. I asked them to say more, and they had trouble, the way people have trouble when the true thing is also the simple thing, and they're afraid the simpleness will make you not believe them. They said the lean man stood there across from the champion, hands low, about to do whatever it was he was about to do, and his eyes, they didn't have the thing fighters' eyes have. They didn't have the hunting in them. The second person had been around enough hard men in their life to know the hunting look, the look that goes flat and cold and locks on, and the lean man didn't have it. What he had, they said, was the look of a man who already knew how something was going to end and was sorry about it, not afraid of it, sorry for it. The way you'd look at a friend who was about to find something out the hard way, something you couldn't save them from finding out, something that was going to cost them. He looked at the champion, the second person told me, the way you look at somebody right before you have to tell them bad news. And then he stopped looking sad, all at once, like a man putting something down because he's run out of time to keep holding it. And that was the part that scared me, not the fighting. I didn't even really see the fighting. It was the moment his eyes stopped being sad. Because right then I understood, and I couldn't have told you how I understood. I'm not a fighting person. I understood that the sad part had been him deciding not to. And now he'd stopped deciding not to. Now, set the two chairs side by side the way I had to, driving home in the dark with my hands too tight on the wheel. The fighter, the trained eye, told me the lean man reached, and that the reach changed in the air into something with a different plan, a scene he couldn't see. Cold. Technical. A thing of motion and range, and the body's honest mechanics. The second person, who saw none of the motion, who couldn't have described the reach if their life hung on it, told me the lean man's eyes were sad, and then stopped being sad, in the instant before whatever happened happened. And here's the thing that put the eyes down my back, the thing I've never gotten warm from since. Line up the timing. The fighter says, the reach started, the champion slipped it, and then the reach turned into something else midair with no decision he could see. No seam. And the second person says, his eyes were sad, and then all at once, the sad went out of them, like a man putting something down. Same instant. They're describing the same instant. The fighter saw it in the hand, a strike that meant one thing and became another with nothing in between. The second person saw it in the eyes, a sorrow that meant one thing and became another with nothing in between. The fighter couldn't find the seam in the motion. The second person found it. It was in the face. The decision the fighter swore he couldn't see, because a fighter never looks at the face, was sitting right there in the lean man's eyes the whole time, plain enough that a person who'd never seen a fight in their life caught it clean. The scene wasn't invisible. The fighter was just looking in the only place it would never show. I have turned that over for years, bro, and it still does something to me. Because think about what it means. The most trained eye in that room, the professional, the man who'd given his life to seeing, was blind to the one thing the least trained eye caught without trying. Not because the professional was worse, because the professional was better. He'd spent his whole life learning not to look at the face, learning that the face lies, learning to read the truth off the body, And that exact mastery is what walked him straight past the truth on this one day, when the truth, for once, was written on the face. And the amateur, who knew nothing, who had no training, who broke every rule a fighter lives by, the amateur saw it because they didn't know better than to look. I went back to the fighter once, after the second chair. I told him, carefully, you always have to be careful with a proud man. I told him what the second person had said about the eyes. About the sadness going out of them in the exact instant his reach turned into something else. And I watched the old fighter's walnut hands go still around his coffee. And he didn't argue. That's what got me. A proud man, presented with a thing that says he missed it, and he didn't argue. He just sat for a long while. And then he said, very low, I don't look at the face. You can't look at the face. The face is where they hide it. And then quieter still, almost to himself, I guess that's where he kept it then. Right out where I'd never look. 2 chairs. 2 accounts that should have nothing to do with each other. One all cold mechanics. One all sorrow and eyes. And when you lay them down together they don't fight. They fit. They're the same 10-second scene from 2 halves of one truth, and neither half could have found the other one alone. The fighter needed the amateur to know where the scene was. The amateur needed the fighter to know what the scene did. But here's what neither of them could give me. Neither of them, for all they saw, the fighter watching the hands, the amateur watching the eyes, neither of them was watching the champion. Think about it. The fighter's eyes were on the lean man's body. The amateur's eyes were locked on the lean man's face. The whole story I've given you so far, both versions of it, is a story about the lean man, what his hand did, what his eyes did, the seam, the sorrow. And the champion is just a shape at the edge of both accounts. The man who slipped, then covered. The body that betrayed 23 years of certainty and brought its hands up. We'd been watching the lean man this whole time, because that's where the 2 of them were looking. But the story isn't really about the lean man. I didn't know that yet, sitting in my car in the dark. I thought it was. I thought the question was, what did the lean man do? It took the 3rd chair to turn me all the way around, because the 3rd person in that room wasn't watching the lean man at all. The 3rd person never took their eyes off the champion. And the 3rd person is the only one who can tell you what the other 2 were too busy to see, the part that came after the guard went up, the smile, and what the champion did with the rest of his life because of 10 seconds in a room full of gold light and turning dust. Before I bring you to that last chair, I owe you a pause, because I've handed you 2 versions now, and you might be sitting there doing what I did, trying to solve it, trying to decide which one's right. The cold fighter or the sad-eyed amateur, which one really saw the 10 seconds? And I want to tell you to stop doing that, not because it's hopeless, because it's the wrong question, and I spent too long on it myself before I understood that, and I'd save you the years if I could. When I started this, I thought a thing you probably think too, that there's one true version of any 10 seconds, and the job is to dig through the witnesses and scrape off what each one got wrong until you hit the hard, clean fact underneath. That's how it always worked. That's how the fighter in me works. Find the truth under the lie, read the body past the face. And it's a good way to work, most of the time. Most of the time, there is a hard, clean fact under there. But some events aren't like that. Some events are too big to fit inside one person, and so they break apart in the seeing, and each witness only catches the piece that fits the shape of who they already are. The fighter caught the mechanics because he was a man of mechanics. The amateur caught the sorrow because they were a person, plainly, of the heart, who looked where the heart looks. They didn't see different things because two of them were wrong. They saw different things because the 10 seconds were bigger than any one set of eyes, and each person took home the piece their own life had built them to carry. I've come to think that's not a flaw in the story. I've come to think that is the story. That what happened in that room was so far past the ordinary that it couldn't be held in a single account, that it needed 3 people to even partly contain it, and even then it leaked out the edges, and even now, with all 3 laid side by side, I can't quite get my arms around the whole of it. There's still a part that won't fit. There's always going to be a part that won't fit. And I've come to think, the champion knew that. I think the champion, in those 10 seconds, meant something that was bigger than what he could hold, too. After 23 years of every fight fitting neatly inside his certainty, his mastery, his unbeatable economy of motion, he met 10 seconds that wouldn't fit. And his body did the only honest thing a body can do when it meets something too big for it. It put its hands up. And then, and only the third chair can tell us why, it smiled. Let me take you to the last chair. The one who watched the champion the whole time. The one who saw the part that matters. The third chair was different from the start, and I knew it inside the first minute, because the third person didn't want to tell me about the lean man at all. The fighter wanted to talk about the lean man's hands. The amateur wanted to talk about the lean man's eyes. The third person, when I asked them what they saw in those 10 seconds, looked at me for a long moment and said, "Why does everybody always ask about the other one?" And I said, because I'm honest, and because by then I had learned to be honest about how little I knew. I said, I don't know. I think because we assume the stories about the man who came in and did the impossible thing. And the third person said, the impossible thing didn't happen to the lean man. The lean man knew exactly what he was doing the whole time. The impossible thing happened to the champion. So why would I watch anybody but the champion? That stopped me, because they were right. And in all my years of chasing this, with all my training, I'd made the same mistake the fighter made and the amateur made. I'd watched the man who moved. And the third person, who maybe understood something about people that neither of the others did, had spent those 10 seconds watching the man it was happening to. So let me give you the third version. The one that finally turned me all the way around. The third person told me they weren't even watching the start of it. Not really. They knew the champion, knew him better than the other two did, I came to understand, though they wouldn't say exactly how, and they told me that what they were watching for, from the second the 2 men stood up, wasn't the fight. It was the champion's face. Because in all the time they'd known him, they'd never once seen that face do anything. It was the stillest face they'd ever known. 23 years of stillness. And some part of them, they admitted, had always wondered what it would take to move it. Had wondered, the way you wonder about a thing you're a little afraid to find out, whether there was anything left in there that could be moved at all. So while the fighter read the hands and the amateur read the lean man's eyes, the third person watched the one face nobody else in the room was looking at. And they told me it happened in 3 parts. They were very clear about this, clearer than either of the others, because they weren't trying to follow a fight they couldn't follow. They were just watching one man, and one man's face is a thing even an amateur can follow if they care enough. The first part, they said, was nothing. The lean man stepped in, did whatever he did. The third person didn't track it, didn't care, and the champion's face did what it always did, which was nothing at all. The mountain, the stillness, the same face that had watched 1,000 men come and 1,000 men go. For the first second or two of those 10, the third person said, they felt almost disappointed. There it is, they thought. Nothing moves him. Nothing ever will. He's going to do the thing he always does, and his face won't even change. The second part was the fear. And the third person had a hard time with this, the way the amateur had a hard time with the sadness, because it was the simple true thing, and they were afraid I wouldn't believe it. They said, for one moment, the champion's face was afraid. Not for long. A flicker. But they'd watched that face for years, and they had never, not once, seen anything cross it, and in the middle of those 10 seconds something crossed it, and the something was fear. The plain animal fear of a man who has just discovered, after 23 years, that the ground he's been standing on his whole life isn't there. His hands came up, the third person said. I didn't even really register the hands. I was watching the face, and the face went, for just a second. The face went like a man who stepped off a stair he thought was there in the dark. That drop. That little drop in the stomach that goes straight to the face before you can stop it. And the hands came up with it. The guard. 23 years gone, and the body and the face told the same truth in the same instant. This one I cannot simply not be where it is. This one is going to reach me. And bro, I want to stop here and just sit in that with you for a second, because this is the thing I came all the way to find and didn't know it. 3 people. 3 different things to watch. The fighter watched the hands and saw a strike with no seam. The amateur watched the lean man's eyes and saw sorrow turn to decision. And the third watched the champion's face and saw, for one flicker, fear. 3 pieces. And they all happened in the same instant, and they all point at the same buried thing, that for the first time in 23 years, in a quiet room full of gold light, the man who couldn't be hit understood that he was about to be hit. The hands knew it. The amateur saw the lean man decide it. The third saw the champion realize it. That's the moment. That's the real 10 seconds. Not a punch landing. A man's certainty ending. You can't film that. The stopwatch can't time that. It only lives in 3 people's memories, in 3 different shapes, and you have to lay all 3 down on top of each other to even see the outline of it. But I told you it happened in 3 parts, and I've only given you 2. The nothing and then the fear. Here's the third part. And the third part is the part that nobody else in that room saw, because nobody else was watching the champion's face long enough to catch what came after the fear. The fighter had gone back to watching the hands. The amateur was still locked on the lean man. Only the third person was still watching the champion when the fear passed. Because the fear did pass. That's the thing. The third person said the fear was there for one flicker, the drop stare, the hands coming up, and then, in the next moment, it was gone. And what replaced it was not the old stillness. It was not the mountain coming back. It was something the third person had also never seen on that face in all the years they'd known it. Something even stranger than the fear, because the fear at least made sense. The champion smiled. Now I have carried this smile around for years, and I'm going to try to give it to you the way the third person gave it to me, slow, because if I rush it you'll hear the wrong thing. It was not a smile of defeat. The third person was clear on that, fierce about it almost, because they'd had people over the years assume that's what it must have been, the loser's smile. The bitter little curl a man does when he's beaten and trying to keep his dignity. No, they said it was nothing like that. They said it was a smile they'd seen exactly once before, years earlier, on a different face entirely, on a young student in the room, the day the student finally understood a thing the champion had been trying to teach him for months. That smile. The one that breaks across a face the instant a locked door comes open. The one that isn't about winning or losing because it's happening somewhere those words don't reach. The smile of a man who has just been shown something true. Think about what that means. 23 years this man had stood at the top of his world, untouchable, and untouchable is a kind of prison even when it looks like a throne, because the untouchable man can never be surprised, can never be taught, can never meet the thing that's bigger than him, because by definition nothing is bigger than him, nothing reaches him, nothing gets through. 23 years of nothing getting through. And you'd think that would feel like victory. The third person, who knew him, told me they'd come to believe over the years that it had felt, to the champion, more like being slowly buried alive in his own perfection. A man sealed off. A man past the reach of any further lesson. A man who had, in the most complete way a man can, run out of teachers. And then a lean stranger walked into a quiet room and, in 10 seconds, reached him. Did the one thing 23 years of the best fighters alive could not do. Got through. Showed him the wall he'd been living behind. Showed him there was still something out there bigger than his certainty, and therefore showed him that he wasn't finished, wasn't sealed, wasn't buried. That there was still, after all of it, more to learn. That the door wasn't locked forever. You raise your guard when you're afraid you'll be hit. The champion's guard came up because, for the first time in 23 years, he could be. And then he smiled, because the same instant that told him he could be hit told him something he'd given up hope of ever hearing again. It told him he wasn't finished. It told him there was a teacher in the room. The third person said the champion held the guard, and held the smile, and the two men stood there in the gold light, and the 10 seconds were over. The stopwatch on its table had ticked its 10 and stopped mattering, and nobody got hit. That's the part people never believe. Nobody got hit. The lean man's hand had stopped halfway, remember, turned into something with a different plan. The plan was never to land. The plan was to show the champion the one thing he'd lived the rest of his life as a better man for having seen, that he could be reached. The blow that didn't land was the most important blow of the champion's entire career, because it was the only one that ever taught him anything. And then, the third person said, the champion lowered his guard. Slow. On purpose this time, not out of carelessness, but out of something closer to respect. And he gave the lean man a small bow. The undefeated man, the wall, the one who couldn't be hit, bowing, in his own room, to the stranger who'd just proven he could be. And the lean man bowed back, and that sad thing the amateur had seen was gone from his eyes now, replaced by something the amateur had also caught in the very last second and never understood until I told him, years later, what the third person told me. The amateur had said that right at the end, the lean man's eyes weren't sad anymore. They were, the amateur said, almost glad. Like a man who delivered the bad news and watched it land as good news instead. Because that's what the lean man had come to do. Not to beat the man who couldn't be beaten. You don't beat a man like that. The fighter was right about that part. The champion was never in danger, never going to be knocked down or knocked out. None of that was ever the point. The lean man came to free him, to reach through 23 years of perfect, lonely, buried certainty and tap the man once, gently, on the only place that was still alive in there, and say, without words, "You're not finished. There's more. I can reach you," which means the world can still teach you, which means you get to be a student again. Welcome back. That's the smile. That's what the third person saw that the other two were too busy to catch. The fighter saw the mechanics and called it safety. The amateur saw the sorrow and called it fate. And only the one who watched the champion's face all the way through saw the whole arc of it. Nothing, then fear, then the smile of a buried man feeling the first air in 23 years. I'll tell you the thing the third person told me last, because they saved it for last too, and I understand now why. The champion fought again after that day. People always ask me that. Did he lose? Did the record finally break? Was that secretly the day the streak ended? No. The streak never ended. He went on, and he won, and he kept winning. And the loss column on that man stayed empty to the end the way it had been empty the whole way through. So if you came to this for the day the wall finally fell, I'm sorry, that day never came. The wall didn't fall. That was never what happened in that room. What happened was the wall learned it was a wall. And a wall that knows it's a wall is a different thing entirely from a wall that thinks it's the whole world. The third person told me that after that afternoon, the champion changed. Not in any way the public ever saw, because the public only saw the wins, and the wins kept coming. He changed in the room. In the training hall, with his own students. They said that before that day, the champion taught the way a perfect man teaches, which is to say from very far away, from the top of a height nobody else could reach, handing down the truth like a man dropping coins to people at the bottom of a well. Correct. Cold. Untouchable. And they said that after that day, he came down off the height. He started teaching like a man who remembered being reached. Like a man who knew now in his body what it felt like to have a locked door come open, and who wanted, more than he wanted to be admired, to do that for somebody else. To be the lean man for some young student who'd gotten too good too fast and started building their own wall without knowing it. The third person said the smile came back sometimes. Years later, they'd be in the hall and a student would finally get a thing they'd been failing at for months, and the door would come open on the young one's face, and the champion, watching, would smile that same smile. The buried man's smile. The one that says, I know that feeling. Somebody gave it to me once. I'm just passing it down the line. And I think that's the part one had to come all this way to find, bro, and it's got nothing to do with fighting at all. A man spent 23 years becoming the best in the world, and the price of it was that nobody could reach him anymore, and being unreachable was killing something in him so slowly he'd stopped noticing it was dying. And one stranger, in 10 seconds, in a quiet room full of gold light, reached him, not to beat him, not to take the record, not to be the one who finally did it. Reached him to give him back the one thing being the best had taken away. The ability to be a student. The ability to be surprised. The ability to learn. The door. That's the most generous thing one fighter ever did for another, and the world never saw it, and only 3 people were even in the room, and not one of them saw the whole of it alone. So now we're at the end, and I owe you the thing I promised at the very start. I told you 3 people watched the same 10 seconds and gave me 3 different stories. And I told you that crack in the accounts is what turned this from a story I heard once into a thing I had to dig up with my own hands. So let me lay all 3 down, side by side, one last time, and tell you what I finally understand about them, and what I never will. The fighter, the trained eye, watched the hands. And he saw a reach that turned into something else midair, a seam he couldn't find, and he saw the champion raise his guard, and he spent the rest of his life calling it safety, because the alternative was admitting he'd watched the only complete man he ever knew become a beginner for 1 second, and he couldn't carry that. The fighter saw the mechanics of the impossible, and the mechanics were real. The hand really did change its plan. The guard really did come up. The amateur, who knew nothing, watched the lean man's eyes, and they saw sorrow turn to decision, sadness that went out all at once, like a man putting something down, and at the very end, gladness, the look of bad news landing as good. The amateur saw the heart of it, and the heart was real too. The lean man really had come sorry, and really had left glad, because what looked like an attack was actually a gift, and the eyes knew it before the hands did. And the third, who watched the one face nobody else watched, saw the whole arc the other 2 couldn't. Nothing, then fear, then the smile of a buried man feeling air. The third saw the meaning of it. And the meaning was real. A man's certainty really did end in that room, and a man's life really did open back up because of it. 3 pieces. The mechanics, the heart, the meaning. And here's what I finally understand, the thing it took me all these years and all these miles to land on. None of them was wrong. That's the answer to the question I started with. I went looking for the one true version under the 3, the way I'd always dug for the truth under the lie, and there wasn't one. There was never going to be one. The 10 seconds were too big to fit inside a single pair of eyes, so they broke into 3, and each person carried home the piece their own life had shaped them to carry. The fighter took the mechanics because he was a man of mechanics. The amateur took the heart because they were a person of the heart. The one who loved him took the meaning, because love is the thing that watches the face when everyone else is watching the hands. And you only get the whole truth, or as close to whole as a person can stand, when you lay all 3 down on top of each other and let them stop fighting and start fitting. The scene the fighter couldn't see was the decision the amateur saw in the eyes. The decision the amateur saw was the moment of meaning the third one read on the champion's face. 3 witnesses, 3 contradictions, and the contradictions don't cancel out, they complete. Like 3 flashlights from 3 angles on one statue in the dark. No single beam shows you the whole thing, but stand all 3 up at once and there it is, the shape of it, almost. Almost. Because I'll be straight with you, the way I've tried to be straight the whole way down. Even with all 3, there's a part that won't fit. There's always going to be a part that won't fit. There's a center to those 10 seconds that lived only inside the champion himself, in the place between the fear and the smile, and that man is gone now and took it with him, and no witness was ever standing close enough to see it, because it didn't happen anywhere a witness could stand. It happened inside. And the inside of another person is the one room you never get into, no matter how many years you spend driving to it in the dark. So I can't give you the clean answer. I never could. I can give you 3 flashlights and the shape they make in my own honest word that the shape is real even though I can't show you the whole of it. And I've made my peace with that. Took me long enough. But I've made it. I want to end where I started, with the smallest thing. 2 hands coming up. A man raised his guard. The most ordinary motion in the entire sport, the thing a child does, the thing you'd do right now if I threw something at your head. And for one man, in one room, on one cold afternoon, it was the least ordinary thing in the world, because he hadn't done it in 23 years, and because doing it meant the end of being untouchable, and because the end of being untouchable was, and this is the whole thing, bro, this is what I drove all those miles to be able to say to you. The end of being untouchable was the best thing that ever happened to him. We spend our lives trying to build the wall, trying to get good enough, sure enough, finished enough that nothing can reach us anymore. We think that's the goal. We think the top of the mountain is a throne. And maybe it is for a while. But there's a man in this story who got all the way to the top, the whole way, further than almost anyone who ever lived, and what he found up there wasn't a throne. It was a grave with a view. He was buried alive in his own perfection, and he'd stopped even feeling the walls. And the kindest thing anyone ever did for him was to walk into a quiet room and prove, in 10 seconds, that he could still be reached. That the door wasn't locked forever. That he wasn't finished. His guard came up. And then he smiled. Not because he lost. He never lost. Because he got to be a student again. Because somebody reached through the wall and handed him back the thing the wall had cost him. And he spent the rest of his life passing it down the line. That's why those 2 things belong in the same instant after all. The guard and the smile. I told you at the start they couldn't both be true, that a man raises his guard because he's afraid and smiles in a fight because he isn't, and that you don't get to be both at once. I was wrong. There's exactly one moment where you get to be both. It's the moment you find out you're not as finished as you thought you were. The fear of it and the joy of it arrive in the same breath, because they're the same news told twice. You can still be reached. And being reached is the most frightening thing in the world, and it is the only thing that keeps you alive. 3 people saw it, 3 different ways, and not one of them, all these years later, has been able to put it down. Neither have I. Maybe now neither will you. Now here's the thing that won't let me go, bro, and I'll leave you with it the way the whole story got left with me. There was another room, years before this one, where the lean man, the one who walked in and reached the unreachable, was himself reached for the first time by his own teacher in his own 10 seconds. Somebody opened that door for him before he ever opened it for anybody else. And I found a witness to that one too. But that's the next one. I'll see you there.